The Echo Chamber, brought to you by the Holmes Report and produced by the international broadcast specialist Marketeers. And sponsored by March Communications, connecting innovation and people.
Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to the Echo Chamber podcast. We're here in Hong Kong with a man who needs no introduction in the PR industry, Richard Edelman. Richard, thanks for being with us.
Good to be in Hong Kong.
We don't have a huge amount of time because, as always, you have a very busy schedule. So I really wanted to start this by asking you about industry growth. Last year looked like a very tough year for many of the big agencies. Within that context, Edelman actually seemed to do better than most, growing 2.1%, but I'm assuming you're not happy with that.
No, 2.1 is not the new normal. We're going to do better than that.
Okay. Why do you think the industry struggled so much last year, given that economic indicators in general looked quite good?
Well, there was pressure on consumer products clients. The old formula of automatic growth in developing markets didn't happen, and corporate communications budgets were under pressure as part of an effort by companies to constrain costs.
How do you see a path back to, the kind of 10% growth that characterized Edelman's emergence as the biggest public relations agency in the world?
So it's multiple. We have to do better in the newer areas for agencies, digital, consulting. Also, I believe deeply in the emerging market companies coming out and becoming big spenders in PR. And lastly, I see us being invaluable in the evolution of companies in what they do, not just what they say. So that if we're in the evolution business, it's beyond purpose actually to change the business line.
Now, Edelman, of course, has been experiencing quite a profound transformation by design. You've hired something like 600 creators and planners as you try to change the agency so that it can contend for marketing budgets. Is that a correct way to characterize it?
Yes, it is to contend for marketing budgets, but it's also to contend at a higher level in the C-suite, advising CCOs and CEOs. So, that we've handled 7 or 8 of the most important crises is partly a function of our ability in digital, our ability in the C-suite, that we can bring paid abilities. So, we're really a different kind of complement to the CCO.
Okay. Now, that kind of change is hard, right? It's been, I think, 5 years since you embarked on this journey. Do you think that transformation has had any impact on the top line growth? I.e., do you think perhaps it's slowed your kind of the double-digit expansion that we saw in previous years?
I think companies hiring Edelman are sure of our ability to deliver, and increasingly our own people are too. The work product has evolved, and it's not simply a matter of titaniums at Cannes, though it was nice to win that with REI. It is a matter of persuading clients that we are the right size, that we are fit for purpose, and that they can use us across multiple business lines, from marketing to corporate positioning to employee engagement.
How long do you think this transformation will take?
It'll probably take us another good 5 years to fully transform ourselves into the communications marketing firm of the future. And I think that this mosh pit of ad agencies, digital firms, PR firms is all still in play, and we intend to compete vigorously. And it's great to be a private family-owned business to make this transformation, because we can make these kinds of investments in talent. And I would encourage anybody who wants to join the pirate ship to think about it, because we really are trying to evolve an industry.
Now, one of the big stories, of course, recently is the merger of Burson Marsteller with Cohn and Wolfe. creates a $700 million agency. How important is scale, do you think? Because it looks to us like the firms that are doing well, or at least that are growing really well, are often in that kind of mid-size category.
Well, I would say that Edelman and Weber Shandwick have global scale, and it's helped us in both cases transform. And I give Donna Imperato a lot of credit for her ambition and her drive, and this is a force to be reckoned with. You know, she has to merge the cultures and merge the work place, but I believe in her ability, and they'll be formidable.
Okay, and for a firm like yours, though, how do you feel like scale is still a competitive advantage?
Scale absolutely matters for us. We can right away turn on 28 countries. We can do a full dimension of services, and do it at a quality and at a price that is important. So we've built to scale, but we also deeply want to compete at a local market basis. We are not interested in just being a global firm. We are global and local, deeply local. Excellent in Italy, for example. Excellent in Korea, at the top class of any firm.
You've brought in some quite senior figures from the advertising industry, and you've put them into senior roles at Edelman. How has that worked out? Because, I guess the risk is that if you bring people in who haven't had experience running a PR agency, maybe it alienates people within the firm.
You see, I think both Carol Potter and Jesse Lynn bring us deep knowledge of markets, understanding of evolution and transformation. Jesse actually transformed McCann in China from a classic ad agency into one that had digital as 35 or 40% of its business. And so that kind of growth for PR agencies is only going to come by having talent that has done transformation. And so we want to have a future of leadership at Edelman that is deeply mixed in terms of its talents and its abilities, and ambitious in its goal.
Okay. And lastly, Richard, you've been quite vocal about the issue of PR industry ethics following the Bell Pottinger saga. How badly do you think that impacted the PR industry?
That incident was a wake-up call, and it was an important moment in which the PRCA in London stood up and said, that's intolerable, that cannot stand, that firm is a disgrace. And that was brave and important for the rest of us, and a sign that we can't take every client. This is not a law business. It is a business that requires the public trust. And so it is a privilege, in a way, to have this position, and to be an enabler of media, but also the idea that you can go direct to end user of information places a special responsibility on people practicing PR, to be sure that the facts are correct and that you make sure that the clients are telling you the truth. All of this is new for us, but it's a responsibility that I welcome for the industry.
Okay. Well, Richard, thank you so much for your time.
And it's always good to see you in Hong Kong.
Indeed, and have a great weekend here.
Okay.
Thank you.
Thank you.
And joining me on the line from London, a long-time friend of the Echo Chamber, it is Sally Costerton. Sally, welcome to the show.
Thank you, Arun. It's very nice to be back.
It's been a while, and we scheduled this a few weeks ago with perfect timing, because it's a very slow news week and not much is happening.
Yes, I don't know what we're going to talk about.
I don't know what. Maybe, having read your most recent LinkedIn post, I wanted to ask you, so what is the profit margin in your Estonian H&K office from 2009? And we've probably lost our listeners now completely.
Well, yes. Well, it was in the spirit of honesty. Not very much was the short answer at the time. I'm sure they're doing very well these days. excellent team of people who I thought were wonderful, but it was our smallest office and it was struggling. And yes, those were difficult times after the crash, no question.
Yeah, and so the context around that, of course, is like many this week. You were sharing your personal recollections of working for Sir Martin Sorrell, who, of course, has stepped down as CEO of WPP. And you mentioned the sort of the fabled quarterly financial meetings that would take place with Sir Martin and his financial henchmen. And you said that this was right after the financial crash of 2009. And you said that for some reason you were fixating, ahead of this meeting, you were fixating on whether he would ask you about your smallest office in Estonia, which I thought was rather amusing, and he didn't in the end. But I thought it was very interesting because those financial meetings were the stuff of legend. I mean, how terrifying were they for you?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, that meeting was, I would think, somewhere around 8 years ago. And as I was writing that post, I could remember it like it was yesterday. And it is to date, and I hope remains, the scariest business meeting I've ever had.
Wow.
Preparing for that meeting. And yes, the reason I was worried about Estonia was not because Estonia was particularly bad, but because it was Martin's ability to know your numbers better than you did. It was quite terrifying. And so it was actually quite reasonable, odd though it may sound, to plan for the fact that he would ask you this just to show that he could. Right. And that was why I was obsessed with it. Now, in the end, he didn't. But we all knew that and Rod Banner said on one of the LinkedIn posts, I don't know if you've seen it, but he said he had a brain like HAL 9000, or has one. We shouldn't talk about the man like he's not still alive.
Right.
And that is one of the most extraordinary phenomena. And I've seen it. Many of us have seen it. Many people talk about it. But when you witness it up front, and there is nothing like it. And I'm not saying it's necessarily a good thing or a pleasant thing, but we took that very seriously. You know, we all believed that he knew our numbers better than we did, or at least that was the working assumption if you were running an organisation, or certainly as well as you did, which is quite extraordinary when you think about the size of WPP.
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting you mentioned Rod Banner. There seems to emerge this week a kind of cottage industry in memoirs of working for Martin Sorrell.
Apologies for that.
No. Actually, it's very interesting because a lot of this stuff people were unwilling to share while he was still in power, because he was a very powerful person. You've just talked about the microscopic detail he held over, it seemed, every kind of operation within WPP. It's bewildering to imagine he could cram so much into his brain, and yet he did. And surely whoever WPP finds to replace him will be a different kind of leader.
Well, yes. I mean, I think that is the central question. I mean, I found it very interesting reading the different kinds of analysis. There's been a very good piece I read last night in the New York Times. The Guardian have written. There's been all sorts of really good journalism. Danny's obviously written a piece in PR Week. You've written about it, as well as those of us who worked in WPP and people who didn't work, like David Brain's just written a piece as well from a sort of competitor perspective. And gathering all those together, it makes me think even more than I did before, what are they going to do next?
Right.
Because it seems to me, I mean, literally, we obviously know what they're going to do. They're going to, they've done it. They're putting Andrew and Mark in as joint COOs, and they are now going to look for a CEO, which may or may not be an internal candidate, which is exactly what I would expect. And that is the sort of Martin foil under a bus scenario, I think one journalist called it.
Yeah.
Both very experienced, worked for Martin for a very long time. These guys really know how WPP works, which is the biggest challenge. Because it's not just Martin's personal capacity to retain data. I mean, I don't imagine they will find somebody else who could do that. Maybe they don't need to.
Maybe it's a good thing.
Maybe it's a good thing.
If they
don't.
I
mean, that was just a characteristic. I'm not sure that's going to be on the job description. But I think what is a much more challenging question is it seems to me then, and even more now, reading everybody's perspectives, is the unique structure of ICANN Freudian slip there, of WPP is the combination of stick and carrot. And everybody writes about the sort of the stick side. You know, they bought creative agencies, they ran them like, you know, ran by accountants, you know, these sorts of criticisms, which has come up quite a lot. But what you have in WPP is an incredible stable of talent, probably unrivaled, certainly world class. And those people, especially the ones that run the big agencies, you know, have sold their businesses but remain very powerful inside those businesses. And Martin managed to get them to do what he wanted. And that, I think, is going to be extremely difficult for the next CEO with the model as it currently exists, because it requires that. You have to both be able to live your brand, trade successfully, compete in the open market, and deliver the WPP margins. That has always been the deal. It doesn't matter who you are, how important you are, how much you got paid for your agency when you sold it. It doesn't matter. Once you're past the earner, everybody's in the same boat.
Right.
And you're required to hit the same kinds of targets. And keeping all those, you know, powerful people and egos managed and performing, to me, now looks even more like a gravity-defying exercise when one thinks of somebody else trying to do it. Martin made that look easy, but I really don't think it is.
But why do you think this isn't the case at other holding companies? They don't have this kind of Sorrell centricity, and they don't appear to need it.
Well, that's an excellent question. It may be that, you know, it's past, you know, it's not necessary. It's just illusory. And that actually the systems and processes are so ingrained that two WPP veterans with, you know, a very significant skill set, you know, Mark and Andrew, will run the machine, and the machine will run well, and all the, you know, big cats will stay and do what they've always done. And that is really how the other holding companies typically work. Because they've all been, to a greater or lesser extent, you know, modelled in a similar way, or at least the publicly listed ones have. So I think that, you know, that may well prove to be the case, in which case, you know, one feels optimistic for the WPP shareholders.
Which we should say includes you, of course. You are. Which
does include me on a micro scale, just to be very clear. I don't think they're worrying too much about what I'm going to be doing with my shares, but yeah, no, it does. And the fact that I've held on to my WPP shares as long as I have is, albeit in a very modest sense, is because I believe in the brand. I still believe in the brand. I don't have to work there. I mean, Martin, of course, is famously a major shareholder, and clearly intends to, or at least for the time being, clearly intends to continue to be one.
Yeah, although
he has no can determine.
Although he has no non-compete. It's interesting.
Isn't that interesting?
Yeah.
I did not know that. Now, I don't know whether it was known or not known. It may be that it never occurred to anybody to ask, because it never occurred to anybody that he would leave. Well, because he told everybody he wouldn't leave.
It's like the succession planning issue as well. I think that was brushed under the rug, if you like, for so many years, because I think there was this idea that Martin would never leave, and if he were to leave, it would be on his terms. And of course, that seems to have been one of the issues that perhaps has triggered his kind of professional demise at WPP. We don't know, of course. I mean, there's so many things here to look at. So let me just come back a little bit to the whole issue of Sir Martin's exit, because over the last, I think so, you know, the initial coverage was one of, I think, you know, shock. It was a classic Saturday night departure. Those of us familiar with public relations like you will know exactly what that timing means, and perhaps you can explain that to our listeners.
Well, historically, I mean, whether this is still true, you'd be a better judge than me, but the Saturday night was to avoid the Sunday newspaper deadlines. Right. I mean, this was a famous mechanism. If you had a controversial or the sort of story that you knew, the Sundays with the long read, the analytical style of copy, the broadsheets, would want to report on. The last thing you would do is give them an opportunity to do that. If you could buy yourself a week away from that kind of analysis. Now, I'm not sure how relevant that is these days, because actually what we saw was the news breaking, I think I saw it first on Sky. I don't know if Sky did actually break the story, but
No, Bloomberg broke.
Bloomberg broke the story. Okay, but it was of course instant. And we all have access to platforms that allow us to share opinions, whether we're journalists or whether we're not these days. So what will be interesting is this week's Sundays, because they will now have to deal with a story that might have gone a bit cold, depending on what happens between now and
but I don't think
Saturday morning.
I'm not sure it's going to work out that well, in the sense that it will tamp down the coverage. If anything, I think it makes them look for angles that maybe they wouldn't have looked for if they had less time on a Saturday. And already we're starting to see a lot of people. There was an excellent article in the Times yesterday which really questioned the manner of Sir Martin's exit, asked some very tough questions about, okay, well, if it wasn't such a big issue, this internal probe, then why didn't he fight it? Given what we know of Sir Martin, he fights or has fought many things, including, of course, that famous legal case in Italy, which was not.
Yes.
we remember that well. It was not.
We do.
Was not particularly good for his reputation, nor some other people within the Group M empire. So you think, okay, if it wasn't material, why didn't he fight it? Perhaps there is more to it than seems the case, and if that is so, then how come WPP isn't being more transparent about it? And I suspect those calls will likely increase, and perhaps will crescendo with this Sunday's newspapers.
Yeah, I think you're right. Definitely think you're right about looking for angles, and that seems to be the big one that hasn't been resolved. And obviously, you saw Vince Cable, slightly bizarrely, anyway, coming out yesterday. But fine. And yes, I know the Times article you're referring to. I think this is a very interesting question about transparency and who has the right to know what. Well, because the way Cable was presenting it was, look, we just have the right to know, effectively was what he was saying. We just do. And, of course, the WPP board were effectively saying, well, they weren't responding, but, well, actually, you don't. We've done what we said we were going to do, and we're not going to share it with you. And I presume, and it is a presumption, that the no talk aspect of it was part of the exit deal. It would be odd if it wasn't. Let's put it that way.
I think that's clear.
So, I think it's a reasonably safe assumption. So the question is, who wants the no talk? Both sides want the no talk. Is what the Times was sort of hinting at yesterday was in fact this activity, whatever it might have been, and we still don't know, actually something that Martin perhaps might not have wanted to discuss. And of course, we're all guessing. I think the thing that I thought at the time, and I may turn out to be completely naive about this, is when it first broke, this man was more famous for how much money he earned than almost anything else. And even people who didn't really know what WPP did or anything much about it knew he was the highest paid UK CEO. It was just the moniker that was being used for him for the last few years. In the same way, for a long time, Bill Gates was famously, the richest man in the world. And so it seems to me quite extraordinary that somebody who is so privately and personally wealthy would get them, and who has been in business for so long, and who doesn't own the company and hasn't ever, I think, been a majority shareholder of WPP, or certainly not since the very earliest days, would be cavalier in that way. It just doesn't stack up to me. Now, of course, I might turn out to be quite wrong, but it just seems so unlikely. This is a man who presumably could afford his own private jet if he wanted one. I don't know. But he's a wealthy man by anybody's standards. And it just seems a very bizarre thing for somebody like Martin to get themselves caught up in, which doesn't mean there hasn't been something. But I agree. I think the lack of resolution and clarity about it isn't going to go away. I do agree with you about that.
Yeah, I think it will increase. It's interesting because, we're in the realm of speculation here, so we have to be
yes, of course. Yes.
a little bit
careful.
Or
any lawyers listening.
Yeah, and I think Martin...
Plenty of WPP lawyers, as we all know, and they're very scary and good.
Yeah, and I think Martin himself has retained 2 law firms,
yes.
and Martin is not averse to a little bit of litigation, as
that is very true,
as we know. But it was interesting that when the investigation was announced, there were 2 things mentioned. One was this sort of financial issue, and another was personal misconduct. Now, I don't know if those are the same things, but when his exit was mentioned, the only reference made to the investigation was to say it involved amounts not material. But there was no reference to the personal misconduct. So I don't know if
it's interesting point.
Different things. Or,
well, I don't know. Somebody picked up on the point about the material issue. I can't remember who it was. It was one of the media commentators that I was reading who said, well, doesn't that depend?
Yeah.
That's a very subjective comment. In other words, WPP is worth, I can't remember, but billions anyway. Its capitalisation is in the billions. And so is a not material amount, how much are we talking about?
Yeah.
Is my not material your fortune? Are we talking, I think the journalist said something like, are we talking $5,000 or $1 million?
Yeah.
Because whilst it might not be material from a reporting standpoint, it might, in absolute terms, seem like a lot of money to, your average person. Yeah. And again, pure speculation, that was a journalist making that point, but picking up on that, pulling at that thread. And that's the sort of thing I think the Sundays will do, is actually go after those sorts of things and say, well, what are we really talking about here?
Yeah.
And whether or not WPP will come under pressure to reveal what's happened. And that will be down to their legal teams.
It'll leak, won't it?
Well, to be honest with you, Arun, I kind of thought it might have done that by now, if it was going to. But I could be, common sense would suggest it will leak, because these things usually do eventually, don't they?
Of course.
But I would bet there are some extremely good lawyers on both sides of this who are tying this up with extraordinary efficacy. So it's possible that it won't leak.
It's possible. I mean, one thing that's been clear is that very few people know exactly what happened.
Yeah,
because otherwise it would have leaked by now.
I agree.
And, they've kept a very tight lid on it. But, as the days go by, the chances of someone saying something to someone else somewhere, which is what we all rely on.
Especially if the story if the story doesn't die down. If it does die down, I think it will stay in a sealed box. If it doesn't die down, people will just keep coming back to it and trying to, and it only takes one person, one casual conversation, and in our viral world that we live in, bingo.
And let's not forget there is an agenda here. I mean, it was leaked in the first place to the Wall Street Journal.
Yes, there was a whistleblower, wasn't there? Right. I think they used the term. I think that's correct, isn't it?
Well, there was a whistleblower internally at WPP.
That's right.
I'm not sure the whistleblower leaked it to the media in the first place.
No, you're right.
That's
how the thing blew up in the first place. It was a whistleblower, wasn't it?
But I think it was leaked. So it was obviously leaked to the Wall Street Journal by someone who knew about it, which suggests, doesn't of course confirm, but it suggests someone who's aware of the investigation. Now, there are many people who've put forth the idea that if this had happened 12 months ago or 24 months ago, it would not have had the same result. So Martin Sorrell would still be in place. And in fact, the reason he's gone is because, as I think you're probably aware, and as I think many people are aware, it seems like there's been a divide growing between Sir Martin on the one hand and the board on the other, whether it's questions around his remuneration or his succession, and of course the company's performance over the last 15 months or so. I mean, what do you think of that theory?
Yeah, well, certainly the question of the succession has been public for years. Yeah. I mean, the questions of being asked from non-executive directors, I mean, you would know better than me, but I mean, it goes back certainly to when I was at Hill & Knowlton.
At least 8 years, I think, people have been asking.
At least. Seriously asking. Major shareholders saying, we need to know what the succession plan is. Who is going to take over from Martin? And I can't remember who it was, but I do recall, not the current chair, but somebody previously, maybe previous chair or maybe previous director, saying, it feels like this is the only conversation that people want to have, about WPP. So that's been around for a long time. So I think it's been very public, very known that the absence of a clear succession strategy was a problem for the board, for the chair, for, the sort of governing structure, and had been for a long time. So I don't think that's new. And I suppose every year that passes, every interview that Martin gave saying, I saw something on LinkedIn saying he'd said, they'll have to shoot me. And then in another one, they'll say, you'll have to carry me out in a box. These are Martin's own words.
Yeah.
So, you can see that one might have seen that certainly from the outside, there was no obvious progress in naming successors. Now, there might have been behind the scenes, but one couldn't see that from the outside. So that's one issue which has certainly not gone away and maybe is intensified as time has gone on. Martin has got older, and the question becomes more pressing for the new chairman, who's going, well, look, I've got to be responsible for finding some answer to this question.
Yeah.
The question about the performance, to me, and just call me an old cynic, plenty of people do, I think is what's really going on here.
Right.
As in, why now? Which is really your question.
Yeah.
Not why, but why now?
Correct.
And I think it's got to be that is the point at which and you can see it from the commentary that shareholders made before, during and after this. You know, they are obviously feeling immensely frustrated with the fact that the share price is broadly, I think it's almost halved in the last 18 months.
Yeah.
Which is really rough, you know. Now the sector's having a rough time, and you know that much more about that than I do. And so what I don't know, and I'm sure you do, is precisely how WPP is tracking on the sector. I think one of the problems with that is that it used to be said, and I don't know if you would still say this, but WPP was the benchmark stock in the sector. And it's often been viewed that way, fairly or unfairly. So in a way, I mean, I'm not sure how useful it is to compare it to the sector, if that makes sense. But there is because I think it's a sort of lead indicator, or it's always been viewed that way. But it's a pretty tough fall in the share price if you're an investor. Yeah. There's no question about that. And there was no obvious evidence that, well, the only thing that seemed to have moved, and I have no idea whether this was in response to the share price falling or whether they just felt it was the right thing to do, was the merger between Cohn and Wolfe and Burson. So that's the first major shift, strategic shift, certainly on the public relations side, that had happened in a very long time. And, you know, must be driven by cost cutting, one assumes. I can't think why else you would do it. I mean, I don't mean that to be, I mean, I'm not saying that's the only reason. I think there are probably a lot of reasons why you might put those two networks together. And Donna is a force of nature, in my experience of her, which is limited, but, you know, immensely impressive person. And she was, and Martin's absolute, you know, for very many years, even before I left Taylor Nelson, Donna was very much seen as the sort of, you know, rising star and very close to Martin.
She didn't have
so
to
I'm
worry
not at all
about,
surprised.
She didn't have to worry about the Estonian office, I think.
Well, there was that too. She would have said that, you know, and then, you know, how different could life have been? No, she's a remarkable woman, and you know, Cohn & Wolfe is an incredible success story under her leadership. So I think that that is a very interesting play. So no, cost cutting is not going to be the only reason. I'm sure there are good strategic benefits to be gained. Lots of challenges. Emerging two big networks is always going to be very tricky. But you know, I feel for them now. She went into print, I think, with you guys, saying something like, you know, he'd held us in his hands for so long, in his strong and capable hands, which I thought was a very interesting sentence. You know, sort of what will we do now kind of thing, which I thought coming from Donna was really a powerful statement. She's a very, you know, confident, successful woman. Yeah. So, you know, I think that is you've got to think that the well, not just the share price itself, but also the forecast. Yeah. He wasn't giving the shareholders an awful lot of hope that things were going to suddenly get better.
No. So that kind of helps us understand why now, if not why. Now, what happens next? Because, of course, the other big story I think that people are looking at, aside from the sort of trying to figure out why exactly he left, the other thing is whether WPP will be broken up, whether it will be acquired outright. I mean, there was an analyst note, I think it was on Monday, suggesting that, you know, the research businesses are the best bet for a quick acquisition, and then after that, actually, it's the PR businesses.
Yeah.
I don't know if you saw that.
Yeah, I did. Yeah.
I mean, the one thing that struck me about that was they had the PR businesses that had the margin for them at only 8%, which surprised me because I always thought it was more. I think the last time we reported the PR margin, it was around 14 to 15%, unless they're talking about margin on total revenue and not on fee income. And you'd probably know that better than me.
Well, certainly the as I'm sure you know, the WP targets were always 15%. I mean, that was the holy grail.
Correct. Yeah.
But certainly during the time I was there, in the latter years during the recession, those were very difficult targets to achieve. So certainly the PR companies have historically achieved those kinds of sort of low teenage multiples in terms of margin. Whether they're still doing it, I'm not sure. And I think those are immensely difficult margins to hit on the scale of operations that you're talking about. And, you know, you and I have talked about this before in the echo chamber. You know, I think this is one of the problems with the holding company model, is it demands kind of margins that are just simply not reflected in reality from the clients, from what clients actually want to pay for.
Yeah.
But yeah, I did see the piece about the PR agencies. I don't know, Arun. I mean, you know, you sort of think about, well, okay, could you sell all the PR agencies together? Well, why would you?
Why would you? Right.
They don't really exist as a thing in their own right. They might do from a reporting standpoint, but they compete with each other.
Yeah, I mean, the only reason I think someone would buy them together is if you're let's say a private equity investor.
Yeah.
And you look at those margins and you think, well, I can double them.
Yeah.
And then I can sell this in X years. Now, I'm not sure you can double them, because I don't think there's a lot of excess cost floating around WPP PR firms. So you kind of have to deliver growth if you're going to improve those margins. And that's very difficult, especially given the scale of some of those agencies. I could see maybe a Blue Focus buying it just as a kind of, okay, this is our best option to reach that kind of scale. But I think they're probably a little leery after their Huntsworth experience.
Mm-hmm. Yes, good point. Yeah.
So you're right. I mean, it seems...
It's a tough one to see exactly how you would... It's not so much how might one parcel it up to sell it. It's more like who would buy it and what would they do with it. You know, why would they buy it? And right, look, I think, don't get me wrong, the likelihood of WPP being broken up in some way, or at least changed from its current configuration without Martin at the helm, has to have gone up. I mean, it has to have gone up.
Yeah.
Martin protected it jealously. I always thought when I was there that he had a sort of romantic attachment, particularly to the sort of Madison Avenue brands, which included Hill & Knowlton, because of course it came in with very early on, came in with the JWT purchase, which was so hard fought for, and was his first really big step forward when WPP was in its early days. And so I think, and despite the famous spat with David Ogilvy, and I think he had an enormous amount of, they became very close and personally as well as professionally. And I think those brands mattered enormously to Martin personally.
Yeah.
So I'm sure he wouldn't have overseen any kind of breakup. I mean, I find that hard to believe. So the question is, you know, to me is a strategic question for the WPP board, is what is your strategy for delivering shareholder growth?
Well, this is a question for all holding companies, I think. And, you know, this...
I mean, they need to have a strategy, or they either need to pursue the strategy they currently have, in which case breaking it up is very difficult. I mean, if you're Reed and Scott, how do you decide, you know, which one of the children you're going to sell and who's going to buy them? And that's a very hard thing to do, particularly as insider. It's not impossible, but it's hard.
Yeah.
I mean, Andrew is particularly experienced with that side of the business. So, you know, who knows? He might have a grand plan. But the business as usual is more conventional when you have this kind of internal succession plan.
Right.
But business as usual means the numbers have got to get better. And as you say, that is, to me, the existential question, is how is that going to happen?
Yeah.
Because I don't think there's lots of fat. There isn't lots of fat.
No, there isn't.
I can tell you from having worked there, they don't do fat.
No. I mean, I think it raises a lot of questions about the holding company model in general. Yeah. And these questions, I guess, have been kind of brought out into the open by the sort of man who embodied the holding group model. In a way, I guess, really invented it and had most to lose from, that model failing, let's say, or perhaps... not succeeding in the way in which shareholders expect it to. So his exit means that people are asking those questions. So one more thing I wanted to ask you, and that's really about Sir Martin's impact on the PR industry. I did a podcast with Paul Holmes yesterday. I don't know if you've listened to it yet, but we kind of realized, he became this kind of accidental PR mogul. He ended up with a lot of PR agencies that came with ad agencies he was trying to buy. And so almost by accident, he became the CEO of the largest collection of PR agencies in the world, at least until Omnicom overtook WPP's PR holdings in the last couple of years, I think it was. But did you ever feel like he was that invested in the performance of his PR agencies? Because I always thought it was not exactly his comfort zone.
Well, I think I would differentiate the public relations as a discipline from the sort of financial performance of the firms.
Yeah.
I think he was always quite supportive of public relations as a discipline. I think he would quite often go, especially in the later years when I was there. Not so much in the early days, but I think in the later days when he began to see the future being much more integrated, much more about content, about earned coverage and media, these kinds of models starting to emerge. And, I think that, I can't remember the exact figure, but some enormous proportion of WPP's revenues now come from what we used to call below-the-line agencies. I know people don't use that expression anymore, but that was, in other words, everything that wasn't classic advertising.
Yeah.
And I think Martin reflected that quite well in terms of the way he would come to the PR conferences. I remember him at the PRCA one where Danny interviewed him, and he was very open and he was very frank and he was very happy to mix in those circles. And internally, he would come and visit the agencies. He would talk to the staff. He was very open. So I don't think we felt that he didn't value the discipline. I certainly never did. And as he also became much more adept at media relations himself. He had been rather, not a recluse exactly, but he did very little in the way of public relations other than the sort of earnings stuff, which you sort of have to do.
Yeah. And
he had a very good media advisor who he listened to, and she worked really well with him. And I remember when he did his first interview in GQ, and it was treated like, amazing event. And he just thrived on it, and he became very confident and a very adept media performer. And I think that helped because he could see the power of the discipline in practice, in his own leadership. In terms of the financial performance, no, I think it was viewed as a cash cow mature business.
Right.
WPP has always been, from an investment perspective, a portfolio. That was Martin's, in a way, big. Maybe it wasn't his original idea, but certainly that was the big idea behind the holding company model in terms of how you drive shareholder return. Was that you have these enormous quantity of investments, and they are all at different stages of maturity, and you are running a portfolio. I always used to think that WPP was more like a hedge fund in some ways, the holding company, than like a sort of creative shop. And in that sense, I think that was what the public relations agencies were. They were very mature businesses, and they were, they were being squeezed for profit.
Right.
And that didn't mean he didn't value them. He nearly loved that, because that's throwing off everything they throw off is financing, debt and leverage to acquire in digital spaces, in Asia, in all the different things that WPP have done over the last 10 years. The money's got to come from somewhere.
But they weren't.
So there's nothing wrong with that.
They weren't seen as vehicles in which to invest.
Well, I'm generalising to make a point, and the current management teams might have a different view. So, I am, with the caveat that my experience is now sort of 6-7 years out of date. But no, I think that there was not a great deal of investment there was not much risk, let's put it that way. There was a very low appetite for risky investment. Okay. I think that probably has changed a bit. Certainly at Hill & Knowlton, I think Richard Miller and Jack have been quite innovative as far as I can see. Yeah. And, you would know that better than me. But no, I think generally speaking, as a group of agencies, it was all about, it was about hitting your number. It was about selling more. It was about winning more business.
Okay, and finally, following on from that comment, really, in terms of the PR agencies within WPP, how do you think people at those agencies are feeling this week? What would you say is the kind of I guess, the attitude? What's the sort of tone of conversations? I mean, are they nervous? Are they proceeding like it's business as usual? What are they telling clients?
Well, none of them have. Quite a few of them commented on my posts and blogs, so they're obviously following things. I'm speculating, but I think what I can say is how would I have felt if it was me, and I think WPP have issued a briefing letter, as you know. I think you published it to clients. Yeah. So good scoop there.
Thank you.
Which I'm sure I'm sure what they're doing, as good public relations people always do, is stick to the message. Don't go off message. And I think that's right. You've got to be consistent and stable and calm and reassuring to clients. That's really, really important. This is the biggest risk that they're going to have in the next few months, is that both their senior talent and their clients will have wobbles, confidence wobbles. That is their biggest risk. And I think that's probably more of if I was running one of the agencies today, I would be much more worried about that than I would about a potential breakup. Because at the end of the day, if WPP decides they're going to break the business up and they're going to sell my business, there's probably not a huge amount I can do about it in reality. But the pressures that I'm going to feel every day from the fact my competitors are going to tap up my best talent. My best talent is looking around saying we don't know what the future holds, or we don't. So getting clarity from WPP on the internal messaging about keeping people at the tops of those agencies very clear, very confident that business as usual is real. And keeping clients feeling like nothing's changed, everything is as it was before, that's going to be the priority. And that's hard. That's always hard. And it's hard if you've got people walking into your office, and I'm not saying they have, but I would be surprised if they haven't. We had this, I remember you and I talking about this when there was the discussion about mergers around, Omnicom and who were they going to merge with, and then they didn't. Publicists, that's right. I remember us having a conversation then and saying the phones must be ringing off the hook.
Yeah.
Now, the boot's on the other foot now, but I still think that's life. That's the business. It's a talent business. It always has been, always will be. And the top talent will be getting telephone calls and emails and WhatsApp messages. And the headhunters must all be jumping up and down excitedly. But in the end, if the clients hold firm, but it's tricky, isn't it? Because they're so interdependent. If you see big talents leave one agency, as ever in the marketing services business and many others, that can threaten client relationships.
Yeah.
And probably that's much more of a risk to WPP, that sense of uncertainty, than the absence of a CEO. Because other than in the biggest clients, Martin wasn't seeing the clients on a daily basis. I mean, he was, I suspect, with the really big clients. But for the BMs, for the Cohn and Wolfes, for the Hill and Knowltons, you didn't see Martin in your client relationship every day. So the issue is going to be about confidence, keeping everybody calm, and that's stressful. So I feel for them. I don't think it's not something I would personally have welcomed. The only thing that would change that, and I'm reluctant to believe it, but if it turns out that something really bad did happen,
then
maybe they'll be relieved. There's a bounce.
There's a bounce. New manager bounce. Maybe.
You just don't know. But that comes back to your question about will we ever find out? I would be surprised if the senior team, they may all know what happened. I would be surprised.
I'm not sure.
I would think the lawyers would have it on lockdown personally, but
Yeah, well, the suggestion is that it was, actually now I remember it, the suggestion is that it was leaked by one of the non-execs. Now, whether that means, do you think the whole board knows? I don't know.
Who knows? I mean, there are sort of governance rules about these things, board chairs have to be very careful at times like this when these sorts of things happen when you're a quoted company. Not my area of expertise other than in general terms.
Yeah, but you made your escape.
Common sense would suggest that you keep it to as few people as possible.
Yes, indeed.
It is a need to know thing. And that need to know might include the whole board, it might not include the whole board, I don't know, it will depend on the governance structure of the WPP board. But what I can tell you is there'll be a lot of lawyers involved in this at the moment, and I would expect that. And I think that's probably actually a good thing. Because you need to have confidence and certainty moving forward. And that's what those agency heads of the PR firms and their teams are going to want. They're going to want to know that things are not going to suddenly, cannon off a cliff. That's the really scary prospect.
Well, Sally, thank you so much for your time. So much to discuss around this story.
Very interesting conversation, and well timed.
Yes, very well
and
timed.
We'll see how it goes. And I wish WPP all the very best. I genuinely do. As I've said in my blog posts, I'm a big fan of Martin's and of the group, and of course my alma mater have enormous affection for. So I really think, I hope that this is going to turn out well. I really do.
Thank you very much, Sally.
Thank you.
You've been listening to The Echo Chamber. Brought to you by The Holmes Report and produced by Marketeers. Sponsored by March Communications, connecting innovation and people.